Welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today because we are unpacking a truly fascinating, meticulously documented piece of history, the paperwork of conquest. So let's just dive right into this. The source material we're exploring today presents a really striking core tension. We're talking about the stark contrast between America's high-minded founding ideals and the actual cold, bureaucratic mechanisms that were used for massive territorial expansion. We're going to look at the spreadsheets, the laws, and the treaties from the 1800s to understand exactly how a young nation mapped its growth and ask ourselves, what was all that paperwork really doing?
I want to start by asking you a question that might actually challenge what you learned in history class. Did the United States actually buy Louisiana in 1803? We've all heard it, right? We learn in school that in the spring of 1803, American politicians over in Paris signed the sweetest real estate deal in history, the Louisiana Purchase, and simply bought a massive chunk of North America from France. But our sources point out a major catch here. France didn't actually own the land they were selling.
So what did the U.S. actually acquire? Well, they weren't buying dirt and trees, they were buying what's called imperial rights. Think of it like a gentleman's agreement among European powers. It basically meant France agreed to step out of the young American empire's way and let them colonize the territory without interference from rival empires. It was absolutely not the outright ownership of the physical land itself. And they got those imperial rights for a very famous price tag, $15 million. With the simple stroke of a pen, the country doubled in size. But the crucial point our source makes is that if the United States wanted actual physical ownership over this land, well, that $15 million to France wasn't going to cut it. They still had to get that land from the hundreds of native tribes who had lived there for thousands of years, way before Europeans even had the idea of leaving their continent.
Section 1. The Treaty Charade. Ideals versus Reality.
Now, U.S. leadership actually knew they didn't own the land and would have to acquire it from the people already living there. But their plan on paper was heavily focused on avoiding the violent conquest typical of the Old World. Just listen to what George Washington said. He was determined that the administration of Indian affairs would be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity. The initial intent of U.S. leadership was to act differently than those old European empires they had just broken away from. The plan was to negotiate, sign formal treaties, and pay the native nations fair and square for their land.
But as you can probably guess, the reality on the ground quickly diverged from those lofty ideals. As Europeans poured in and the U.S. population boomed, the demand for land absolutely skyrocketed. And unsurprisingly, many tribes had zero interest in trading their ancestral homes for, farming equipment. So when tribes said no, the tactics shifted. The expansion playbook quickly grew to include using brute military force when tribes refused to sell, completely ignoring previously established treaty borders, and straight up invading legally recognized lands. The documented shenanigans were pretty wild, ranging from getting tribal leaders intoxicated to trick them into signing away land, to simply plucking random unauthorized individuals out of thin air, calling them tribal representatives, and having them sign on behalf of the whole tribe.
To show you how quickly this paperwork was tossed out the window, let's walk through a specific historical timeline regarding the Sioux and Arapaho nations. At year 0, these tribes actually repeatedly defeated the U.S. military in conflict. So what happens in year 1? The U.S. signs a peace treaty, formally acknowledging their land. They were safe, right? Well, fast forward to year 8, and gold is discovered on that territory. By year 9, the U.S. completely breaks the treaty, redraws the boundaries, and begins building roads right through their land so settlers could harvest the gold. Official treaties were routinely abandoned the second powerful economic interests entered the chat.
Section 2. The Cotton Kingdom, targeting the Deep South. Down in this region, a really fascinating dynamic existed where native nations lived side by side with early settlers for a long time. There were 5 specific large nations: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. They were known at the time as the 5 civilized tribes. They held legally recognized treaties with the U.S., but they were also heavily assimilated with European customs. We're talking practicing farming, speaking English, wearing European clothes, and some even participated in the practice of owning slaves. This high level of assimilation really challenges the assumption that peaceful coexistence was somehow impossible. There was a world where these tribes could have remained right there on their land, living alongside European settlers.
But peaceful coexistence was totally upended by an economic catalyst. The source material highlights the Black Belt Prairie. This was a highly desirable strip of land in the Deep South that was absolutely perfect for growing a very valuable cash crop: cotton. This booming global industry was extremely lucrative, heavily relying on the free labor of stolen Africans.
The huge problem for the farmers looking to expand their cotton kingdom? This prime real estate was locked up in formal U.S. treaties, legally held by native nations.
Driven by this incredible potential for immense wealth, aggressive local governments began making up their own rules. The state of Georgia in particular was intensely aggressive in targeting native populations to seize this valuable farmland. The governor of Georgia at the time explicitly stated his intent was to replace all of the red with white population. They actually went so far as passing laws to abolish the Cherokee tribal governments entirely.
Section 3. Defying the Supreme Court. The ultimate test.
Now, the Cherokee Nation wasn't going to simply stand by. They fought back using the exact same legal system the U.S. championed, taking the state of Georgia all the way to court. And that case went to the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation. They stated clearly that states could not impose on tribal sovereignty. The Cherokee had ironclad rights to their land. But, as we know, a ruling only works if the executive branch enforces it. And President Andrew Jackson's response? Outright refusal. He famously snarked about Chief Justice John Marshall, saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it."
To understand why the president would just blatantly ignore the Supreme Court, the source provides some crucial context about Andrew Jackson's intensely hostile worldview toward First Americans. He basically thought negotiating treaties with them was a ridiculous joke. Take a look at a letter he wrote to his wife from the battlefield during the War of 1812. He actually boasted about successfully slaughtering 170 Native Americans in, quote, an elegant style. It's incredibly chilling. So instead of enforcing the Supreme Court ruling, Jackson pushed his worldview right into federal law with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The text of the law maintained the charade of high-minded ideals. It mandated that the government negotiate fair, voluntary, peaceful treaties to relocate tribes to the Great Plains, which, by the way, was viewed at the time as an uninhabitable dumping ground. It was quite literally a paper trail of pretend humanity. The law stated it wouldn't break pre-existing agreements, all while using taxpayer money to mask what the source describes as a state-sponsored campaign of ethnic cleansing, just to secure the land for the Cotton Empire.
Section 4. The Trail of Tears, the Tragic Conclusion.
To see the dark reality of what these broken legal frameworks resulted in, we really only have to look at the final bureaucratic charade used against the Cherokee. It perfectly illustrates how the paperwork functioned. Step 1. The U.S. acquires a signature from an unauthorized individual agreeing to sell the last portion of Cherokee land. Step 2. The actual Cherokee chief furiously protests this fake signature, pointing out the guy had zero authority. Step 3. The U.S. government completely ignores the protest. They had a signature on a piece of paper, and in their eyes, that cold legal justification was all they needed to send in the military.
Let's put the massive scale of this history into perspective with some rapid-fire numbers. 368. Over the course of almost 100 years, the United States signed 368 treaties with tribal nations. It was a massive, meticulous paper trail masking an imperial conquest.
100,000. Between 1831 and 1838, nearly every single member of those 5 tribes we discussed was expelled from their ancestral land. 100,000 people forcibly removed from their homes.
Over 1,000. Those expelled were forced to walk by foot for more than 1,000 miles. It was a grueling physical reality, moving through brutal weather and terrain toward a little unknown box allocated to them on a map. Some bravely stood their ground, until they were bound in chains and herded west at gunpoint.
The historical toll of this event, which we now know as the Trail of Tears, is staggering. Estimates range between 3,000 and 15,000 deaths. But the sheer tragedy is compounded by how systematic it all was. This was state-sponsored displacement, meticulously documented via receipts, payments, laws, and treaties. It's essentially a collection of 19th-century spreadsheets orchestrating the displacement of entire nations. In fact, this bureaucratic process was so brutally effective that 100 years later, Adolf Hitler explicitly referenced this exact historical blueprint, citing the U.S. expansion as a model for his own campaigns of ethnic cleansing in Europe.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought to close out our explainer today. When a nation's expansion is meticulously documented in treaties and laws, does the paperwork justify the progress or merely disguise the conquest? It's a heavy question, and it challenges us to deeply reconsider the nature of historical narratives and how easily a facade of justice can be written right into the law. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this source material today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you in the next explainer.